I tell very exciting and horrifying stories to everyone. I suggest you subscribe because I post such stories every day. Story 1. The Shadow at Cold Hollow. On the outskirts of a forgotten town lay Cold Hollow, an ancient farmhouse that had stood empty for as long as anyone could remember. The property was shunned by the locals, and even the bravest among them felt a chill when passing by. Ivy twisted up its crumbling facade, and the windows seemed to glare out at anyone approaching, as though the house itself had its own sinister intentions. When Adam, a historian with a fascination for haunted locations, purchased the property, he did it with more curiosity than caution. To him, the old tales of Cold Hollow were merely exaggerated folklore, stories invented by previous generations to explain disappearances and the occasional madness that plagued the area. He moved in during the dead of winter, determined to document everything about the house's history. On his first night, the silence was unbearable, the type of stillness that seemed to devour sound itself. Adam tried to settle in, ignoring the unease that crept over him. The cold bit through the walls of the house, seeping into Adam's bones. Even with the fireplace roaring, there was a chill in the air that seemed unnatural. The rooms were dark and expansive, and the flickering shadows cast by a single lamp seemed to dance and sway, creating eerie shapes on the walls. Adam tried to ignore the sensation of being watched, chalking it up to his overactive imagination and the heavy, almost oppressive history of the place. As the days turned into weeks, Adam's exploration of the house unearthed strange artifacts, children's toys, old photographs, and an unsettling doll with cracked porcelain skin. He found handwritten letters, some in languages he couldn't read, and all of them carried an aura of despair, like silent cries for help. But it was the shadow that began to haunt him. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light. He would see it out of the corner of his eye, a shape darker than the rest of the room, a figure that never seemed quite solid. It lingered at the edges of his vision, always slipping away when he turned to confront it. One evening, as Adam sat at his desk in the study, going through a stack of old books, the shadow appeared again. It moved behind him, just out of sight, and he felt an inexplicable urge to look, but fear rooted him in place. His hands shook as he continued flipping through pages, trying to focus on anything but the creeping darkness at his back. He could almost hear the silence, a heavy, pressing nothingness that seemed to grow louder the longer he ignored it. One night, the shadow grew bolder. Adam was working late, his laptop illuminating the kitchen, when he felt a coldness that sank into his bones. The lights flickered, and the room fell into darkness. As Adam reached for his flashlight, he saw it. Not a shadow, but a silhouette. Tall, unnaturally thin, with limbs that seemed to stretch and warp with every flicker of light. It stood just beyond the kitchen doorway, faceless and unmoving. He tried to shout, but his voice was swallowed by the cold. The figure seemed to melt into the darkness as soon as the flashlight beam touched it, leaving behind only the lingering dread. The next day, Adam found scratches on the walls, deep, jagged lines that hadn't been there before. He tried to convince himself it was an animal, but deep down, he knew better. The shadow was no longer just watching. It was trying to communicate. He felt its presence everywhere, following him through the halls, standing at the foot of his bed at night. He could hear its whispers, a soft, unintelligible muttering that echoed through the empty house. It wanted something, and whatever it was, Adam feared he could not give it. Adam began having vivid nightmares. He dreamed of the house in its prime, children running through the halls, a family sitting down for dinner. But the family members had hollow eyes, their mouths sewn shut, and they moved like marionettes, their limbs jerking awkwardly as they turned to stare at him. In every dream, the shadow was there, standing behind them, its hand resting on the father's shoulder, as though it controlled them all. Adam would wake up drenched in sweat, the whispers from his dreams echoing in his ears. Adam decided to confront whatever was in the house. He spent hours researching the property's history, uncovering stories that were far darker than he had anticipated. There were rumors of rituals performed by the original owners, of sacrifices meant to bind spirits to the place, to grant power and protect the land. The shadow, he realized, wasn't just a ghost. It was something far more sinister, something that had been trapped and was now growing restless. One night, in a desperate attempt to confront the entity, Adam set up cameras throughout the house. He sat in the living room, watching the monitors, waiting for the shadow to appear. Hours passed, and just as he began to drift into uneasy sleep, he heard a noise, a soft, childlike giggle. He looked at the monitor, and there it was. The shadow was in the room with him, standing right behind his chair, a hand stretched out towards him. Adam turned, but the room was empty. The chill deepened, and the lights went out. The last thing he heard before darkness swallowed him was the sound of tiny footsteps rushing towards him. When they found the house a week later, Adam was gone. The cameras showed nothing but static. The walls were covered in scratches, and the doll sat in the middle of the living room, its cracked face turned towards the door, as if waiting for someone else to come inside. But the story didn't end there. The locals noticed that anyone who even approached Cold Hollow began to change. They grew withdrawn, plagued by vivid nightmares, their eyes always darting to unseen corners. Some said they saw Adam's face at the window, his eyes hollow and his mouth open in a silent scream. The shadow, it seemed, had found a new puppet, and it wasn't finished yet. Story 2. The Whispering Woods. No one dared enter the Whispering Woods after dusk. The villagers spoke of voices, gentle, alluring whispers that called to those who strayed too far from the path. They said the trees themselves were alive, not with sap and leaves, but with the souls of the lost, and that the forest had a hunger that could never be sated. Mara, a skeptic by nature, had heard the tales all her life. She was a journalist, determined to write an exposé on the so-called haunted woods that had terrified her village for generations. Armed with nothing but a flashlight and a notebook, she ventured into the forest one cold autumn evening, determined to debunk the myths. The air grew thick as she moved deeper, the trees towering above, their branches like skeletal fingers blotting out the sky. The deeper she went, the quieter the world became. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. As night fell, Mara heard it, a soft whisper, her name carried on the breeze. She paused, shining her flashlight around, but saw nothing. The whisper came again, closer this time, more insistent. It was a voice she recognized, her mother, who had passed away years ago. "Mara, come home," it pleaded, the words dripping with desperation. Mara's heart pounded, but she pressed on, convinced it was all in her head. But the voices grew louder, more numerous. They echoed through the trees. Her father, her childhood friends, even voices she didn't recognize, all calling her name, all urging her to go deeper. The flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment she saw them, faces in the bark of the trees, twisted in agony, mouths open in silent screams. Panic set in, and Mara turned to run, but the forest had changed. The path was gone, replaced by an endless maze of trees that all looked the same. The whispers grew frantic, angry. The ground seemed to shift beneath her feet, roots rising to trip her, branches clawing at her skin. She stumbled, falling into the cold earth, and the voices surrounded her, a cacophony of sorrow and rage. As the flashlight died, Mara saw them, figures made of shadow and bark, their eyes hollow, their mouths twisted into cruel smiles. They reached for her, their touch like ice, and Mara felt herself being pulled into the earth, the whispers turning into screams. The last thing she saw was the forest floor closing above her, the trees swaying gently as if in mourning. The next morning, the villagers found her notebook at the edge of the woods, the pages filled with frantic scribbles. The last entry was a single sentence, scrawled over and over. The forest is hungry. The village changed after that night. People began disappearing, one by one. Those who entered the woods in search of Mara never returned. Some claimed to see her at the edge of the forest, her eyes hollow, her mouth moving as if she were still trying to scream. The whispers, once distant, could now be heard even in the village square, calling, pleading, promising secrets that no one should ever know. The forest had awakened, and it would not rest until it was full. The whispers began to spread beyond the woods, creeping into the village at night, seeping through windows and slipping under doors. Children woke in the middle of the night, speaking of the tall, dark figures that watched them from the edge of their rooms. Pets went missing, their collars found at the edge of the whispering woods, torn and bloody. The whispers called to everyone, young and old, promising things that seemed too good to be true. Some villagers swore they could hear their lost loved ones, voices they had thought gone forever, calling to them from the forest, begging for help, for release. Soon, the village was emptying. Those who remained barricaded their homes, but it was useless. The whispers were inside their minds, whispering promises of reunions, of forgotten dreams, of things they had always longed for, but never thought they could have. The woods were hungry, and now the village was its prey. It would not stop until every last soul was devoured. Story 3. The Haunting of Ashburn Asylum. Ashburn Asylum had been abandoned for decades, a place of horror that the town had tried to forget. The stories of the asylum were dark, patients who had vanished, doctors who had gone mad, and the whispers of inhumane experiments conducted in the dead of night. The building loomed on the outskirts of town, its windows shattered, the walls covered in graffiti and ivy. It was said that no one who entered Ashburn ever came back the same. When a group of friends, Ethan, Claire, and Marcus, decided to spend the night in the asylum, they did it as a joke, a test of courage. Armed with flashlights and a video camera, they broke in through a side window, their laughter echoing through the empty halls. The air inside was thick with the smell of mildew and decay, the floor littered with debris. They wandered through the halls, their voices growing quieter as the building seemed to swallow the sound. It started subtly, a door slamming in the distance, the sound of footsteps echoing from the floors above. They laughed it off, attributing it to the wind or animals. But then they heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping like someone drumming their fingers against the wall. It followed them as they moved, growing louder, more insistent. Claire shone her flashlight down a dark hallway, and for a brief moment, They saw her, a woman in a hospital gown, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror. She stood motionless, her mouth moving as if she were trying to speak, but no sound came out. Ethan approached. The camera focused on her, but as he got closer, the figure vanished, leaving behind only the echo of her silent scream. The friends exchanged uneasy glances, the bravado of their earlier adventure quickly fading. They decided to leave, but the asylum had other plans. The halls twisted and changed. Doors that had once been open were now locked, and the tapping, now a frantic pounding, seemed to come from all directions. Panic set in as they ran through the labyrinthine halls, the air growing colder with each step. Marcus was the first to fall behind, his screams echoing through the building before being abruptly cut off. Claire and Ethan pressed on, their flashlights flickering, the shadows growing thicker, almost alive. They could hear whispers now, soft and taunting, voices that seemed to come from within the walls. They reached the main hall, the exit in sight, but standing between them and freedom was the woman. Her face was twisted in anguish, her eyes black voids. She raised her hand, pointing at them, her mouth opening wide in a soundless wail. The walls began to close in, the ceiling lowering, the building itself seeming to breathe, to pulse with malevolent intent. Claire pushed Ethan towards the door, her voice barely a whisper, "Go." He stumbled out into the night, turning just in time to see the doors slam shut, Claire's terrified face disappearing behind them. The townspeople found Ethan the next morning, wandering the outskirts of town, his eyes vacant, his hair turned white. He spoke of the tapping, of the woman, and of the whispers that still echoed in his mind. No one dared return to Ashburn Asylum, and on quiet nights, the townspeople swore they could hear it, the soft tapping coming from deep within the abandoned halls, as if someone or something was still trying to get out. Ethan never recovered. He spent his days staring at nothing, his nights filled with screams that no one could silence. The asylum seemed to reach for him even from miles away. And then, one night, Ethan vanished. His bed was empty, the window wide open. The only clue was a trail of muddy footprints leading away from his house, footprints that ended at the gates of Ashburn Asylum. The asylum stood silent, its doors closed, its windows dark. But those who dared to listen claimed they could hear a new sound now, not just tapping, but the faint echo of Ethan's voice, calling for help, forever lost in the maze of shadows and despair that was Ashburn. The local children, curious and naive, would dare each other to go near, and they always returned with eyes wide and mouths silent. They claimed to have seen Ethan, his face pressed against the window, his hands pounding against the glass, desperate to escape. The town slowly became a ghost of what it once was, haunted by the presence of Ashburn Asylum. The building seemed to grow darker, the shadows within it longer, as though it fed off the fear of those around it. People began moving away, unable to stand the constant whispers that seemed to emanate from the very ground. The asylum was alive, and it wanted them all. The final straw came when the mayor's son disappeared. His bike was found near the asylum gates, the wheels still spinning, but there was no sign of the boy. The town held a meeting, and it was decided Ashburn had to be destroyed. A group of men gathered with sledgehammers and gasoline, determined to bring the asylum down. They broke through the gates, their faces set with grim determination. But as they approached, the building seemed to groan, the very walls shifting, the windows darkening further. One by one, The men began to hear it, the tapping, the whispers, the desperate cries for help. Some dropped their tools and ran, their courage failing them. Those who remained lit the gasoline, watching as the flames began to lick at the old stone walls. For a moment, it seemed as though they had succeeded. The fire roared, the heat intense, and the men cheered. But then, from within the flames, they heard it, a scream, high-pitched and filled with agony. The walls began to pulse, the shadows twisting, and from the smoke emerged figures, patients, doctors, and Ethan. Their faces were twisted in pain, their mouths open in silent wails. The men ran, but none of them made it out of the gates. The fire died as quickly as it had begun, leaving the asylum untouched, the figures gone, as though they had never been there. The town was abandoned after that. No one dared stay, not with the asylum standing, watching, waiting. The building loomed over the empty streets, a dark reminder of the horrors within. And on quiet nights, if you listen closely, you can still hear it. The soft tapping, the whispers, the cries for help. Ashburn Asylum stands, a monument to the darkness that lies within us all, waiting for the next soul foolish enough to enter its halls.